the so-called E3, so that's the three European powers, were worried that there might be a military intervention in Iran after the Iraq War, and so negotiations began in 2003 in order to try to find a negotiated and therefore peaceful solution that would satisfy all parties and make sure that Iran remained a non-nuclear nation, so no nuclear weapons. After 15 years of negotiations, a little more actually, it's more, or really more at 18 years of negotiations, the goal is still the same, which is to say to avoid a military confrontation and at the same time, as I said, prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons. Now, since 2003, the negotiations with Iran have gone through several transformations. For the first 3 years, the three European powers negotiated alone and actually managed to get quite close to a deal. Then the United States joined, and when the US joined the talks, Iran was also referred to the UN Security Council. What that means is that the matter was seized by the UN Security Council. And as a result of the Security Council's discussions and decisions, the UN imposed sanctions on the Iranian nuclear program. You might wonder how effective negotiations can be when sanctions are imposed. Well, you would be right to question it. After the UN imposed sanctions, there were EU and US unilateral sanctions. And after that, there were secret negotiations that took place in Oman, directly between the United States and Iran. So the ultimate result of all of these different talks was that the JCPOA, which is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was approved in July 2015. It was approved by what we call the P5+1 and Iran. The P5+1, of course, means the 5 permanent members of the United States, UN Security Council. So the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia, as well as the +1, which was Germany. A period of active investments and trade followed the approval of the JCPOA. And all the while, Iran was very careful to comply with the limitations agreed on its nuclear program. However, as you're all aware, domestic politics, especially in the United States and Iran, have had a major part to play in how negotiations with Iran and the JCPOA unfolded. So with the outcome of the US presidential elections in 2016, the situation took a turn, and I might argue a turn for the worse. After the 2016 elections, suddenly trade and investment were no longer possible in Iran because of new US sanctions. The US exited the JCPOA and instead started to apply a policy of maximum pressure towards Iran. The aim of all of that pressure that the US was applying was to isolate Iran from the international community. In response, obviously, the Iranians were not happy and they started to overstep the limits of the JCPOA. And they did so gradually and constantly pointing out that this overstepping of the JCPOA was reversible. Now, with the most recent change in the US president last year, there is suddenly, much like in 2013 and 2015, an actual desire and political will to negotiate. This time, the negotiators are not the P5+1, but the P4+1 and Iran. So you might wonder, okay, 4 or 5, who's left out? Well, the United States, as it happens. The US delegation is on the sidelines because they exited the original agreement. Now, it has been agreed that the negotiations will only deal with the nuclear program. There are other concerns that both the previous US administration and Iran would like dealt with, but those concerns, for instance, related to regional issues in the Middle East, are not going to be discussed in these negotiations. Now, there are also risks in addition to the political will that I've mentioned on both sides. The first risk is about who goes first. The Iranians have demanded that the US should first lift sanctions. The United States has required that Iran first return to the limits that were approved in the JCPOA. The US has required that the US requiring Iran to first return to the JCPOA and Iran vice versa asking for sanctions to be lifted is a standard problem in diplomacy and especially nuclear diplomacy. And here, the way that a solution is trying to be negotiated is through a sort of shuttle diplomacy. Shuttle diplomacy is an expression which means that basically there are negotiations happening in two separate places, and then there's someone shuttling back and forth between these places, passing on messages and trying to make sure the negotiations can move forward simultaneously in both fora. Now, there are all sorts of additional issues that I could raise, but I think one of the most relevant aspects right now is that there's all sorts of opposition to the JCPOA. First and foremost, there is, of course, opposition from other regional players in the Middle East that were not included in the agreement. That's the case for Israel, and it's the case for Saudi Arabia in particular. There have been cases of sabotage on Iranian soil, whose aims may have been to spoil these current negotiations. On the positive side, Saudi Arabia and Iran are now talking to each other through a mediation process that is led by Iraq. There's also other issues, such as the fact that there is a lot of domestic politics involved in whether the United States and Iran can come to an agreement. As I'm sure you know, there is a lot of opposition from Republicans and conservative hardliners in the United States against the JCPOA, and they've cited a number of reasons. There is also a lot of opposition from Iranian hardliners and conservatives. Recently, the Iranian parliament tried to block the negotiations by issuing a deadline for sanctions relief. If the US didn't lift sanctions on Iran by a certain deadline, then the parliament decided that it would pass a law where negotiations would be off the table. So I think I'm close to my time limit, so I'm going to stop there. I hope you found the consecutive, or the speech rather, interesting and not overly difficult. Thank you.